All right, I think we'll get started. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this talk that is not about Android, and it's not about tech. I think it's my first time doing this. I wrote the slides this weekend. I have no idea if I have too much content or not enough content, so we'll see together what happens. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Romain Guy. I'm an engineer on the framework team, on the Android framework team at Google, but we're not here for that today. We are here for photos. All the photos you see in this talk are available on these different websites, mainly on Flickr. I used to use Google+, but I think that's over now. You can also follow me on Twitter and Instagram if you want to see those pictures. I've been taking photos since 2005 when I first moved to the US. I went on a road trip, I fell in love with the Southwest, I bought a nice camera, and since I haven't stopped, and now what I do is I make other people buy nice cameras and go on road trips with me. So we have Nicolas Roa over there, works on content layout, he's my partner in crime, and a lot of those pictures have been taken with him. So in this talk, I will give you technical information and information about composition and stuff like that. It applies to pretty much all cameras, but for the technical aspect, I kind of assume that you're not using a cell phone, although some of this also applies to the Android camera. So I assume that you're using some kind of a mirrorless camera like this one, or a DSLR, or even a fancy pocket camera like the Sony RX100 that has enough manual controls. So first, before you can learn about how to take good pictures from a visual standpoint, you need to master the concept of exposure. So this is the technical aspect of taking pictures, and you need to master it enough so that you don't have to think about it when you take pictures. You need to think about other things. You need to think about framing, composition, and your subject. So you really need to get that ingrained into your brain so you don't have to stop and think about it when you're on the street and you're about to catch the right photo. So every camera has something called a light meter, and it looks a little bit something like this. It's different depending on the camera. On this Fuji, for instance, it's a vertical line and it goes from -3 to +3. It will look different on every camera, but it looks something like this. So when we talk about achieving the proper exposure, what we mean is that we want this little indicator to be pointed at the 0 on that light meter. If the indicator is pointing at the -1 or at a negative value, it means that your image is underexposed. It's too dark according to the camera. And of course, there's the opposite. If it's pointing at a positive value, that means the image is too bright, once again, according to the camera. But what does it mean for the exposure to be correct? When is it at 0? So if we take a photo, I'm sorry, the screen looks very different from the actual pictures. It's a little too contrasty, but believe me, this photo doesn't have a lot of shadows. It doesn't have a lot of bright regions. It's basically a very average photo, and when I took it, the exposure was technically correct as far as the camera is concerned. So to understand what the camera is measuring, we can downsample this image to 1 by 1 pixel, and what we get is this. We get the sRGB value 157, 157, 157, which happens to be very close to 127, which is halfway between black and white. And that's called the middle gray. And this is basically what a camera does. A camera tries to achieve the right exposure, assuming that everything in the frame is average brightness. So this is called 18% gray. It's not 18% gray when you use RGB values. It's actually 50%. This means that we're trying to expose for surfaces that reflect 18% of the light. I won't go into details. There's math that explains why 18% becomes 50%, but you don't need to know about any of this. You need to know that it's called 18% because that's what you're going to see in books, on websites, or if you ever talk with a photographer. That also means that because the camera is trying really hard to expose for that mid-level gray, things like dark objects will appear maybe too bright if they fill the scene, or if you have very bright objects throughout the scene, they might appear too dark. You can use their tools. For instance, there's a gray card. This is something you can buy. It costs a few bucks. This is an actual 50% gray, and you can use that. You can point your camera at this to achieve the proper exposure if you want the true right exposure for the current scene. So if you go back to the light meter, we know what the camera does, but now we have those numbers. What do they mean? So those numbers are called stops. When you go from 0 to 1 or 1 to 2, there's a difference of 1 stop. And 1 stop means that you have either 2 times more light or 2 times less light. And this is going to be very important when you want to change the settings on your camera to achieve the proper exposure. So if we take an example of a picture that was correctly exposed, here it looks too dark on the screen, but it shouldn't look dark. If we change the brightness of the image by 1 stop, so we go to the left to -1, now the image is darker. If we increase by +1 stop, now the image is brighter. So far, it makes sense. So to control the exposure, to be able to move that needle so that it's exactly on the 0, you have 3 settings on your camera you can use. There's the aperture, the shutter speed, and the sensitivity. So we'll start with sensitivity because it's pretty much the least interesting of all 3. The sensitivity is often called ISO. It's a ISO followed by a number. And on your camera, you will see something like this. So you're going to have an ISO setting that ranges from 100 to insane value these days. Some cameras go up to 400,000. And those are typical values that you're going to use, 100, 200, 400. And every time you increase the ISO value, you're going to get a brighter image. One of the downsides of changing the sensitivity is that you also increase the noise of the sensor because you're changing the gain, the electronic gain of the sensor. So it doesn't have any artistic value, changing the ISO. It's just there as a helper to help you achieve the exposure you want. And every time you double the ISO, if you multiply the ISO by 2, you are increasing the exposure by 1 stop. So you're doubling the amount of light that the camera receives. So let's take an example. Here we have the light meter of our camera. It's reading that the scene is underexposed. We have an ISO of 100. We have a shutter speed and an aperture. We don't really care about those for now. And we know that we want the needle to be in front of the 0. So to do that, because we are 1 stop underexposed, all we have to do is double the ISO number and go to ISO 200. And now we've achieved proper exposure. As a rule of thumb, you should always try to use the lowest ISO value that you can because of that noise problem I just mentioned. Thankfully, modern cameras are actually very, very, very good at handling ISO. When I started 10 years ago, it was out of the question to use a value like ISO 800 even during daylight. And nowadays, I routinely use values up all the way to 6400 or even more, and it's just fine. There are also tools like Lightroom, Photoshop, and others that will help you remove the noise when you process the image. So the next setting you can use is the shutter speed. That one is pretty simple. It simply controls how long the shutter of the camera remains open. The shutter can be a mechanical shutter, it can be inside the camera, it can be inside the lens, it can be an electronic shutter. It doesn't really matter, it just means how much time will the camera spend reading data from the scene. So again, you can use this to go from dark to bright. The reading the shutter speed is a little counterintuitive at first because you're going to see values like this, 30, 15, 8, 4, 2, 1, and then 2 again, followed by an S. So those are actually fractions of a second. 30 means 1/30th of a second. 15 means 1/15th of a second, and so on. And once you enter, like when you're past 1 second, they label them with S so that you know that you're at more than 1 second. And again, the difference between those pairs of values is exactly 1 stop. So when you double the amount of time that the camera spends reading the scene, you double the amount of light that you receive on the sensor, so you double the brightness of the image. So that's another setting you can use if you're underexposed. You can just reduce the shutter speed, double it to get the proper exposure. So unlike ISO, I mentioned that ISO doesn't have any really artistic value, but shutter speed does. The speed that you're going to choose will greatly influence the final look of the image. So at high speed, you can use high shutter speeds to capture action, to freeze an action. And when you lower the shutter speed, you're going to start leaving trails behind any moving object. It can be light or it can be an actual physically moving object. And the longer you set the shutter speed, the more blur you're going to get. So if we look at an example, so those are 2 pictures I took in the same spot. It was at the Museum of Electricity in Tokyo, I think. This is a plasma ball, and on the left I used 1/25th of a second as the shutter speed, so that's pretty fast. And you can see there's a high ISO, because I had to set a very high ISO to be able to achieve proper exposure. And the speed was fast enough that I could capture the, well, I don't even know how to call them, but the electric bolts inside the plasma ball. And on the right, same thing, except I used the 6-second shutter speed. So now, as these electric arcs are moving, they blur together and we get a very, very different effect. And you can also notice that because I increased the shutter speed, I was getting more light. I had to decrease the sensitivity down to ISO 100 so I could get the same exposure. This is another example of using fast shutter speed. That biker was moving pretty fast, so I had to use 400ths of a second to be able to freeze the action and not get any motion blur. Sometimes the subject is not moving fast. Those mountains are staying pretty still. But I was on a helicopter, and the helicopter itself was moving fast. So here you can see I used a high ISO value, a high sensitivity of 1000, and a shutter speed of 640 40th of a second to be able to capture the scene without too much motion blur. And actually, if you were to zoom on that picture, you would see that it's not perfectly sharp, but it's sharp enough. And sometimes you want the exact opposite. Sometimes you just want a long exposure to create, particular effects. So here I wanted to smooth out the sky and I wanted to smooth out the water. So I use a very low ISO and a high shutter speed of over 1 second to be able to capture all that motion in the frame. And you can take this extremely far. So this is a scene in Bryce Canyon. The clouds were moving pretty slowly, and I really wanted to have that smooth effect. So I used the shutter speed of 8 minutes to be able to capture this. This is also why the picture is in black and white, because after 8 minutes, your sensor starts to heat up, and you're getting a lot of noise, and it looks very nasty. So black and white to the rescue. So one tip you can use is usually when you're using your camera handheld, when you're just holding the camera and you don't have a tripod, a good rule of thumb is that you should use the 1 divided by the focal length of your current lens as the slowest shutter speed. So for instance, if I have a 50 millimeter lens like here on this camera, I should use 1/50th of a second as the longest shutter speed. If you go slower than that, chances are that you're gonna get a lot of motion blur. This can be alleviated if you have in-body stabilization or if your lens has a stabilizer. It really depends on the gear that you are using, but this is a pretty good rule of thumb that I use pretty much all the time. And the last and third setting you can use is the aperture. So I kept this one for last because it's a little more complicated than the other ones. It's actually a very confusing way to think about it. So here you can see the aperture numbers. They are not multiples of 2. There's just this weird series of numbers that you kind of have to learn by heart. So 2, 2.84, and so on. And you can also see that the brightness decreases as the numbers go up, which is exactly the opposite of the shutter speed and the ISO. So when you have a low value, so f2 for instance, it means that the lens is wide open. The iris inside the lens is completely open. And as you increase the aperture value, you decrease the opening inside the lens, and you get less and less light. And that value is often noted, most of the time it's noted f divided by. And like I said, those values are not multiples of 2, but the difference between those magical numbers is still 1 stop. So you just have to learn those numbers by heart. If you're underexposed or overexposed and you want to change the aperture, you just have to know which value to go to. There's more values after 16, it's 22, and before 2, it's 1.4, but it's pretty easy to remember them. The reason, what those numbers actually mean is that the aperture noted n here is the focal length divided by the diameter of the iris. So for instance, I measured at home, I have a 50 millimeter lens. When it's wide open, the diameter of the opening is 35 millimeter. And when you divide 50 by 35, you get 1.4. And that's why the notation is f divided by, because f, the focal length divided by 1.4, the aperture, I get back the diameter 35. You don't need to remember that, but there's a good reason why we use this word notation. Aperture has another impact on your picture, and this is where the artistic control comes in. It controls the depth of field of the image. So the depth of field is the distance between the nearest object and the furthest object that will appear to be acceptably sharp. That won't mean they will be perfectly sharp. It will mean they will be acceptably sharp enough. So if we go back to our scale of apertures, when we have a large aperture, so a small number, we have a very shallow depth of field, and not much in the frame will be in focus. And actually, with very fast lenses, in the past I've used a lens that was f0.95, you only get a few millimeter worth of focus. So it can be very tricky to use when you're shooting a portrait or street photography or stuff like that. And as you decrease the aperture by increasing the f number, you just increase the depth of field. So typically, when you're doing urban photography or landscapes, you're going to increase the depth of field to get more stuff in focus. So here are a few examples. For instance, at the Monterey Bay Aquarium, I wanted to take a picture of that fish, in this nice blurry background to be able to see the fish as well as possible. So I used an aperture of f2.8. And you can see that even with this aperture, there's not much that's in focus because the eye and the nose, or whatever it's called in a fish, are in focus, but the rest of the body becomes slightly blurry. That means we don't have enough depth of field to be able to see everything sharply. Here I used a shallow depth of field for a very different reason. I took the picture in black and white, it was rainy, and my friend had this sad look on her face, And by using the shallow depth of field, I'm able to isolate the subject even more and convey, like, emphasize this feeling of loneliness and sadness that I guess she was feeling at the time. It's also very useful to achieve a cinematic look. So here I used a wide aspect ratio. There's a lot of contrast in the image. We have the bright lights. The focus is on those two people, and the rest of the image has this nice background blur. It's typical of the kind of stuff that you see in movies. You can also use shallow depths of field for just interesting effects. Those were random Christmas lights on the street in Tokyo. So I used the shallowest depths of field I had. I completely defocused the image, and you get just those nice patterns and colors. We don't even know what we're looking at, but it looks pretty. And sometimes that's what it is about. Like, you just want something that looks pretty. And of course, when you shoot landscape, most of the time you will want everything to be sharp. So this is Grand Canyon. Grand Canyon is really, really big. So you really want the largest depths of field you want. So here I was using f16, which was the maximum that my lens could achieve. And everything is sharp from front to back. So we have those three ways to control exposure. Only two can be used for artistic control, aperture and shutter speed. So when you're shooting something, you should ask yourself only two questions. First of all, which is the effect that you want to achieve? Do you want a background blur? Do you want full sharpness? Do you want to freeze the action? Or do you want, like, nice long trails of lights? Or you want to smooth out the motion of water? And once you know what you want, you have to decide what are you going to sacrifice to achieve this. Most of the time, you should sacrifice sensitivity, so the ISO value, because it doesn't really affect the look of the image. And like I said, with modern cameras and current processing tools, you can pretty easily get rid of noise. And if you have a bit of noise in your image, it's not a big deal. A lot of my images have noise, and nobody has complained so far. But to make those decisions, you also need to make sure that your camera is in the right mode. So most cameras will have those four modes available. The first one is called P, which makes no sense. It means program, but it's actually the full automatic mode, where the camera makes all the decisions for you. Never use this, because that means you have no artistic control whatsoever on the look of the final image. I don't even know why they include this. Shutter priority, that means you set the shutter speed, and the aperture will be chosen for you. I also don't like this one very much. I prefer aperture priority, because aperture, most of the time, you won't be trying to freeze frame the action, or you won't be trying to create, like, trails of something. You really want to decide whether you want everything to be sharp, or whether you want background blur. So I recommend that you use this one pretty much all the time, and that's the one I use all the time. And finally, you have the manual mode, where you have to set everything yourself. In all those modes, you can change the ISO yourself. And what I do most of the time, so we don't care about automatic and shutter priority. What I use most of the time is auto ISO, because like I said, with modern cameras, you pretty much don't have to worry about this a lot. The only time when I change the ISO is when I take landscape pictures, because I'm on a tripod. So we will use the lowest ISO possible, and I will let the shutter speed increase all the way. And I also use manual mode with fixed ISO when I want to create motion blur effects. There's another mode called B for bulb. That's when you do really, really long exposures. Usually the manual mode stops at about 30 seconds. So if you need more than 30 seconds, which should be pretty rare, you have to switch to a different mode called bulb. And this one can be a little annoying, because you have to press the shutter and keep the shutter pressed yourself. I remember, like, very, very cold nights where I have to keep the shutter pressed for several minutes. And you do that over and over again. It's really annoying. Another useful tool to check the exposure of your image is the histogram. So this is another properly exposed image. There are shadows, but not that many. There's highlights, but not that many. There's only the sun that's pretty much blown out at the horizon. But overall, this image is pretty average. So your camera or your processing tool can show you a histogram. You can see the histogram of the RGB channels. They're not very useful. The part that's interesting is the white histogram. So that shows you the distribution of pixels by luminosity or intensity. So on the left side, you have all the dark pixels. On the right side, you have all the bright pixels. And what you want for correct exposure most of the time is a nice bell-shaped curve, which is pretty much what you see here. On the right, you can see there's a spike in the highlights, and that's the sun at the horizon. But other than that, the picture is properly exposed. We have nice tonal gradations. We transition from one brightness to another in a pretty smooth manner. But you don't always want to do this. So this is a picture in Tokyo. It's a lot darker. We have bright light sources in this image, but overall there's a lot of shadows. So if we look at the histogram, you can see that most of the pixels are on the dark side. And again, we have a spike for the different highlights in the image. This is another picture taken at night in Tokyo. This is called a high-key photo, so there's not a lot of contrast and everything is pretty bright. And again, if you look at the histogram, you can see that here where most of the pixels are pushed to the right. So the histogram can be really useful if your camera has a way to show you the histogram while you're taking a picture. It can be an easy way for you to assess the exposure, and you can easily change your settings to make sure it looks the way you want. If you know that you want a dark look or a bright look, you can use the settings to achieve something that is not technically the correct exposure, but that's still the exposure that you want. The last thing you can use, a lot of cameras have something called exposure compensation. Sometimes it's a dial that looks like this, sometimes it's just a setting that you can set, and just a number, usually between -2 and +2. And that number can be used to force the camera to change the exposure. So for instance, you're in aperture priority mode, you set your aperture to exactly the aperture you wanted for artistic reasons, and the camera is telling you that everything is properly exposed. That's great. But what if you want the picture to be brighter or darker? Instead of changing the aperture, because that would compromise your artistic decision, you can use the exposure compensation. So what the camera will do, it will either change the ISO, if you're an auto ISO, or it will change the shutter speed to achieve the exposure that you wanted. A situation where this becomes very useful is when you shoot snow, for instance. So I mentioned that cameras basically try to expose for something that's a mid-gray, something halfway between black and white. Snow is very white, so if you let the camera do its job, sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes the snow will come out pretty gray. So in that situation, you can use the exposure compensation to force the camera to take a brighter picture and get the tones that you want. So to recap exposure, let's say that we have an exposure here at ISO 200, we have a hundredths of a second at f4, so aperture 4, and it is properly exposed according to the camera. If we wanted to have more depth of field, we could decrease the aperture to f11, so we have more depth of field, but we're getting less light. So the difference between f4 and f11 is f5, 6, f8, and f11, that's 3 stops. So we need to find those 3 stops somewhere else. So we slow down the shutter speed by 2 stops. We go from 100 to 50 to 25, and then we increase the ISO, so we gain our 3 stops back. So we do those 2 sets of settings are exactly the same. We have a proper exposure of the scene, but you have a very different feel in the final image, because with f4, you're going to get some background blur. With f11, everything's going to be sharp. And one last example, so if you want even more background blur, let's say I want to open the aperture to f2, so we're going from f4 to 2.8 to 2, so that's 2 stops. So we need to slow down something else, so we're decreasing the shutter speed and we're decreasing the ISO to counteract this choice. So the 3 settings are linked together. And again, you should always start with what you want to achieve, freezing the frame, having motion trails, background blur, or sharpness. Set that setting, so the shutter speed of the aperture, and from that, set the other ones. All right, so that was it for the technical part. Now we're going to talk about composing a photograph. There's a number of rules. I mean, they're called rules online. I don't like to call them rules because you can break them whenever you want, and a lot of very good pictures don't follow any of those rules, so they are more guidelines. The first one and the most well-known is called the rule of thirds. So the idea is that you can decompose the image in thirds, and there are studies that show that our eyes are naturally drawn toward the intersections of those thirds. And what you should do when you compose a photograph is basically put the subject on one of those lines or at the intersection points. So I'll show you some examples. This one, photo taken in Tokyo, there was this silhouette in front of this very bright background, so I want to take the picture. And as you can see, if I overlay a grid, the silhouette is exactly at 1/3 of the image. That gives you a nice balanced feel to the picture. This picture is also interesting because I took the picture while walking, and I wanted background blur. And this is not a sharp picture. If you look closely at the silhouette, it's actually pretty blurry, but that doesn't make it a bad picture nonetheless. So online, you're going to see a lot of talks about sharpness and how to achieve maximum sharpness and so on. Yes, you should do that if you can, but it's not the end of the world if you can't. That doesn't make a bad picture necessarily. Here's another example, still in Tokyo. So here, with the rule of third, we can see that all the heads, basically, and the eyes of the main subject are on one of the lines. Their bodies are in the bottom 2/3. The main subject is enclosed in the last third of the image. And so this is like a perfect example of following the rule of third. Another one, the eye of the subject that's in focus is exactly on one of the thirds. And you can also see that the body of the creature is tucked neatly into the different rectangles created by the rule of thirds. It's also useful for landscapes. This is a picture I took with Nicola actually this summer in Sonoma. You can see here the horizon is on one of those lines. There was also this weird lenticular effect. That's not the sun. I don't know what that is, but that looked amazing. So it's also on on the third line, and in every third of the picture, horizontally, you have a big rock, and the one on the left occupies the entire third. So again, gives you a nice balanced composition. For landscapes, typically you will want to have the sky in the top 2/3 of the image. The next tool you can use for composition is leading lines. They're pretty obvious with man-made structures. So here, for instance, that's the pier in Pacifica, not far from here. And if I draw the lines, they get you toward the horizon, they converge in the same spot. So that one's very obvious. Sometimes you can create your own guidelines, your own leading lines. So here we have a few lines that exist because of the barrier, because of the painting on the street. But I also use the long exposure to create additional leading line to reinforce the effect. So you can see the line of people walking by and then all the tail lights of the cars passing by with a long exposure to create even more lines. The lines don't have to take you to the horizon. You can also use them to draw the viewer's attention to anything you want in the picture. So in this one, we have the lines from the different buildings that converge in the center of the image. And once you're in the center of the image, we have a vertical line that takes you from top to bottom. And that way I can draw I can basically make you look at things in the order that I want. This also uses the rule of thirds. We have 2/3 of one building and 1/3 of the other building. The next composition tool is frames. Here's an obvious one. You have a door frame. You put someone in the door frame. Well, you frame the someone. That's a pretty obvious one, but it's pretty effective to, again, draw the attention. And you can also use frames as negative space. That would work equally well if the person was outside of the frame. This one is a little more subtle. So we have this subject here that has those black pants and this white shirt, and you can see that I put the top part of the subject in white exactly in that in front of that yellow poster, so it draws your attention because of the color difference. But there's also another frame in the picture that encompasses the entire subject. And because the subject was looking at their phone, by basically putting him inside those two frames, we can kind of keep him away from the rest of the world. We have the rest of the image is pretty open, so it just reinforces like what the subject is doing and you know, feelings and emotions and all that. That one is an interesting one. So that was in Seoul. She was crying, so I guess something bad was happening to that couple. I hope not too bad. But anyway, so what really drew my attention here is their shadows, not the people themselves, because you can see there's a busy background. They're hard to see. So I really wanted to draw the attention of the viewer to the shadows. And here I use two things. We have leading lines, the edges of the shadows, but they also help form another frame. So the frame doesn't have to be a perfect rectangle that's man-made. It can be shadows or lighting. Anything in the image. It can be colors as well. Anything you can use to draw the attention works. Another tool is layers. The most obvious use of layers, of course, is in landscape photography. This is Delicate Arch next to Moab in Utah. And you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's a bunch of layers in the image, even in the sky, like the clouds themselves have many layers. And layers are interesting because they help you spend more time looking at the picture. It makes the picture more interesting because there's more for you to see and discover. And like I said, like they're very useful for landscapes. One of the reasons sometimes landscape pictures don't come out good is because you're not going to have those layers for most of the image. I've been to many beautiful places where it looks amazing in person, and then you take a picture, it's extremely disappointing. It's because you have this just wide open field of grass, and in a picture it's just boring. You can also find layers in cities pretty easily. So here I've used different buildings. So there's 3 different buildings, there's different shades, and between the angles of the buildings, their natural shape and the way I position myself to take the picture, you get these different breaks in the picture that create layers. It almost looks like a landscape. This one was interesting because usually when I do street photography or urban photography, I don't use a zoom lens, so I have a fixed focal length, so I have to move with my own feet to be able to achieve the effect I want. So here I position myself to make sure I will not be able to see the sky between the buildings to be able to create this effect. So that's actually, in general, a tip that you should follow. Like, if you see something interesting, don't just stand there and take the picture. You can try to move a little bit. And actually, Nicola is really good at that. He's better at that than me when we take landscapes. So I try to follow his lead. Another interesting example of layers. So here we have the first obvious set of layers, the shape of the building itself. So we have those curves that just run into each other, so almost like a waterfall. It's interesting. But I also used a large depth of field with a small aperture. And I did that so that the reflections would be sharp. So that's another layer that you get in the picture. And when you do street photography, that's something you can use effectively. For instance, if you're looking into a store or a restaurant, you can use whatever's inside plus the reflections from the street inside the window to create different layers for the viewer to look at. And the last tool that you can use is patterns. This is an example of natural patterns that was taken with a drone. We have layers and patterns, so we can always combine things. But patterns don't necessarily have to be regular or man-made. So this is a more organic pattern, also taken with a drone. That's the bay, the south tip of the bay. But patterns are the most interesting when you can break the pattern. So the reason I took this photo is because we have this extremely regular pattern of all the windows and the colors on this building, and there's one open window. And it's almost kind of like a little reward for the viewer that you find this one thing that's out of place and draws your attention. And I still wonder why that window was open. I hope it was not a bad thing that happened there. And well, I didn't see anyone fall, so. So remember that those are just guidelines, right? They're not rules, you can break them. The reason I mentioned them is because they are useful tools, and you should probably spend time learning them. Most of the time I don't even think about this. Sometimes people say, oh, you have a good eye. It's not that you have a good eye, it's that you've internalized those tools that you can integrate them into your frames without even thinking about it. And once you know how to use those tools, and once you master them with big air quotes, you can feel free to break the rules. This is a picture I love. I took that picture in Antelope Canyon. I love it because it looks like almost there's some kind of bird that's flying from the sand into the air. It's not using the rule of third. There's kind of a frame with the rocks, but it's not a complete frame, so it's a bad frame. There's kind of a leading line, but not really, with a beam of light. And the subject is dead in the center. That doesn't mean it's a bad picture. At least to me, it's a very good picture. So again, those are just tools that you can use to help you. And if you're new to photography, you can definitely follow them. They will, very quickly help you improve your photos. But feel free to just ignore them when you think that the result looks better. So another thing that's often overlooked when it comes to framing is the problem of the aspect ratio. So most cameras have an aspect ratio of 3:2 or 4:3. So this is a 4:3 camera. I have another camera here that's a 3:2. Your phone is a 3:2. Micro Four Thirds cameras are called Micro Four Thirds because they have an aspect ratio of 4:3. DSLRs are 3:2 most of the time. It's pretty rare to find a different aspect ratio. There are a few cameras out there that are like that, but they tend to be very special cameras that you probably don't want to get anyway. But because that's the way, because the images coming out of your camera will have the same aspect ratio as your sensor, that doesn't mean that it's the aspect ratio that you should use when you're shooting your picture. So I want to talk about some of the aspect ratios that I like to use. There are others, but these are the ones that I really enjoy using. So the first is square, or 1:1. That was made very, very popular by Instagram. It used to be very popular back in the film days. There's some medium format cameras out there that still use this format. And this format is particularly useful when you do street photography or portraits, because it helps you, it creates a feel of intimacy. It helps you draw the user into the scene. So here, for instance, there was a frame, a natural frame in the picture, and we feel a lot closer, it's almost as if we're inside, sitting at that bar with those characters. The next one is 16:9, so it's a panoramic aspect ratio. It nicely matches modern displays, so your TV is probably 16:9, computer displays are 16:9. Our phones are 16:9, actually, not the ones with the notches, but other phones are 16:9. If you turn off the notch, it's probably back to 16:9. With a notch, I think we're at 2:1. So it's a fairly natural viewing experience for people today, because we're all used to this format. It's like watching old movies. If you watch old movies, they had an aspect ratio of 4:3 for a lot of them, and it feels really weird to watch them now. Anyway, so this is a wide aspect ratio, and it's extremely well suited for landscapes, obviously. So this is Monument Valley. You have this wide open landscape, and the 16:9 like helps you like convey this feel of openness and wideness, if that's a word. It's also useful in urban environments. So here I use 16:9 because I was creating a lot of motion using a long exposure. So you see a lot of trails at the bottom from the cars. There's a truck on the left side of the image, and there's a train. And the 16:9 just emphasizes this horizontal motion. Then there's 239:1. This is the current widescreen standard for movies. So that's why when even on your 16:9 widescreen TV, you still have black bars at the top and at the bottom. It's because as our TVs became wider, the movie industry said, hey, you know what? We're going to go even wider than that. They really want us to have those black bars. And I've been using that one for a couple of years now, and I really, really like it in a large number of situations. And actually, a lot of the pictures we've seen already in this presentation use this aspect ratio. So again, Monument Valley works extremely well for wide open spaces. It also works really well for a cinematic look and feel because that's what we're used to when we're watching movies. So here we use a shadow depth of field to create background blur. We have a dual tone image. We have a lot of blue and yellow. Movies love to do this kind of stuff. And we have focus on the characters and a lot of high contrast. So aspect ratio is a composition tool. This is not something you should do after you take the picture. I've done this. But you should really think about it at the time you're taking the picture. You should think about the aspect ratio. And the hardest thing is actually to remember when you come home and you look at your pictures on your computer, which ones were meant to be used with which aspect ratio. So you can take notes. I've done that before, like I take notes on my phone to remember which ones should be which. And finally, so we have 10 minutes left, so I'm going to give you a bunch of random tips, and then hopefully I'll have time for a few questions. So the first one, blue skies are boring. This makes California, or at least the Bay Area, extremely obnoxious for landscape photography because the sky is always perfectly blue and empty. So here's an example. It's a picture I took with Nicola this summer in Monument Valley. We were super lucky. We got clouds. We had water in Death Valley. Apparently it had just rained, which basically never happens. So, interesting pictures, tons of clouds, reflection, and all that. Now, here's a Photoshop version of the same picture without the clouds, and becomes very boring. Just because you have this empty space and there's nothing for the viewer to look at. This is why I spend a lot of time watching webcams. There's a number of free webcams on the coast that you can watch online, and you will be able to see whether or not there are clouds and whether or not you should get off your couch and go stand in the cold to take pictures. The next tip is simply to be there. I would love to take even more pictures, but it's not going to happen when I don't leave home. And sometimes it's difficult. It's a warm Sunday afternoon. You're at home with your kids or playing video games, and you have to decide to go to the coast and freeze your ass off for a couple hours, waiting for a picture that will probably never come, and get dirty, and then go back home and realize that you messed up one of the settings in your camera and all your pictures are bad. But that's the only way to do it. It sounds obvious, but you have to get out there and take pictures. So this is an example, this Golden Gate Bridge. To get that shot, I went to the Golden Gate, I think almost every night over the course of 2 weeks. I was waiting for the fog to be in the right place at the right time. And if you don't go there, it's not going to happen. So I went there over and over again, and finally I got a shot. It's not the shot I was expecting, but I like it anyway. I wanted the fog to be at the bottom. So I guess I should go again. Look around. When you take pictures, it's especially landscape pictures when you're on this tripod and you have your eye glued to the camera. It's very easy to be lost in what you're doing, which is messing up with the settings of the camera, and to ignore what's going on around you. So here's a couple examples. I was taking pictures at Rockaway Beach, which is on the coast further south from here. And I was taking pictures of the sunset, and then I decided to follow my own advice and look behind me. And I saw that there were those storm clouds that had just showed up behind, and it looked like it was almost nighttime over the land, and all the restaurants and the houses had turned on their lights. So by changing my frame, I got this picture, which is really weird because it's like daylight over the ocean, but it's nighttime over the land. That lasted for about 1 or 2 minutes, so it would have been very easy for me to miss that shot had I not been looking around to see what was going on. This is another interesting one. I was taking pictures at the Horseshoe Bend with a friend. I looked at him, and the sun was about to disappear behind the horizon. You can see the sky is blue, so it's already the blue hour. It's after sunset. So I was able to quickly expose for the bright part of the sky to give me this nice silhouette that lasted, again, like maybe a couple minutes at most, and I could have easily missed that shot if I hadn't been looking. So plan, I use a lot of tools to plan, especially for landscape photography. So I use maps and apps like Sun Surveyor will show you where the sun will set, where the sun will rise, the length of the shadows for different parts of the landscape. I use like Doppler radar websites that will show you like if there's fog or clouds over the ocean. I use webcams to know, when I should get off my butt and go take pictures. And this is an example at Sutro Bath in San Francisco. By using webcams from the coast, I was able to assess that, because I don't live in San Francisco, so I was able to assess that the sky would be nice for a picture, and I already knew the place, so I was able to run to my car, drive as fast as legally possible, and get that shot. But also don't plan. That's more for street and urban photography. When I'm in a city like Tokyo, you've seen a lot of pictures of Tokyo, I usually walk for about 10 hours a day. I walk like everywhere I can, and I look at Google Maps, and anything that looks strange or interesting or like a tiny street, well, I try to walk there. And you can see a lot of interesting things. You don't necessarily get a lot of good pictures out of it, but at least you get to enjoy like something different that's not in the guides. I was in Santa Monica last year, and I'm going to brag that it was to shoot a TV commercial. So I was walking like in the back streets of Santa Monica, and I stumbled upon that building, and I found that very interesting because that person has an American flag on their building, and they have a German car parked next to it. So contrast is not always about colors or light. It can also be about subjects inside the picture. Be safe. So that one is pretty obvious when you're in your city. Like, don't go in areas that look sketchy. Be careful if you have fancy equipment. But for landscape photography, here are the things that you should pack with you. So first of all, tell someone where you're going. Nicola and I have been in a couple of places, like we went off-road, we blew a tire, you're 20 miles away from the town, it's dark, and you don't know where the spare tire is, and you don't have cell reception, so it can be pretty bad. We've also been to places, for instance, Delicate Arch I mentioned earlier, where you're going to go watch the sunset. It's kind of like a 2-mile hike. It's not hard, but you're in the middle of nowhere. And when you come back, it's nighttime, and it's high in altitude, and we see people wearing sandals, and they don't have water, and they don't have light. And every year you hear those horrible stories about people getting lost or dying or stuff like that. So pack these: good shoes and a hat, lots of water. Fun fact, you can survive for about 2 weeks without food, so don't worry about food, worry about water. Pack flashlights and batteries, especially if you're going to go capture the sunset, because you're going to come back and it's going to be nighttime, so you need to know where you're going, especially when you have a very heavy backpack on your back. Warm clothes, rain gear, first aid kit, that kind of stuff. And finally, practice. You can read books all you want about how to take photos. The only way to get good at it is to go out and take pictures. And finally, I have a few minutes for Q&A. So if you have any questions. Yes?
So when you walk around and take a picture, do you bring...
So when I walk around and I take pictures, do I bring a lot of lenses? So to give you an idea, when I walk around in a city, this is the bag I bring. This holds one camera and maybe 2 or 3 lenses. Those are not zoom lenses, those are prime lenses, so one focal length. And when I go take landscape pictures, this is what I carry. Also 2 or 3 lenses and a lot of filters and all the equipment I was talking about, so first aid kits and tools and stuff like that. It's very heavy and super annoying to carry around. And then Nicola likes to carry, he's like a snail, he likes to carry his entire house with him. It's actually pretty impressive. He manages to, we have the same backpack, and somehow he puts like 4 times the amount of stuff in the same bag than I do, so props to him.
In one of your sections, the aspect ratio, I guess.
So yeah, when do you decide the 1/2 rule? You don't necessarily decide. It looked good. Like I said, those are just guidelines, they're not rules. It just looked good to me. And sometimes you just can't because the scene doesn't work with this rule of thirds. So don't think about it too much. Especially with landscape photography, like 1/2 can work really well if you have interesting skies, of course, and an interesting foreground. If there's nothing else to show, you should probably change your ratio. And even the rule of third is pretty loose. I mean, it's not exactly 33%. It's a range. Right, so the question, so we have 3 settings, ISO, shutter speed, and aperture, and what does exposure compensation do? So when you're in manual, exposure compensation doesn't do anything. When you're in aperture priority, exposure compensation will change the shutter speed. or the ISO if you're in auto ISO. And when you're in shutter priority, exposure compensation will change the aperture or the ISO. So it always changes the one you're not controlling yourself.
Do you ever use Flash?
How do I post-process pictures? Right, so this should probably be another talk. I wanted to talk about it, but 45 minutes is way too short. But yeah, there's a lot to say about that.
How many hours do you take between taking pictures and then processing?
So how many hours between?
Yeah, do you invest more time in processing pictures?
Oh, do you spend more time processing pictures or taking pictures? Definitely processing and editing. So, removing the pictures that are not good and all that stuff. The shooting itself usually is not, it doesn't take that long. So the main filters I use, right here, so I have a whole bunch of them. But the main ones are a circular polarizer. So a circular polarizer can be used to remove reflections. So when you take pictures of water or vegetation, you're gonna have a lot of reflections. So you can use a circular polarizer to get rid of that. I also use what's called neutral gradient filters. So they look like this. It's basically smoked glass as a gradient. And you use it for landscape, especially at sunset, because it will darken the sky and keep the landscape itself, unoccluded. It helps you achieve proper exposure when there's a huge dynamic range, when there's a huge difference between the sky and the land. I also use them to slow down the exposure. So earlier I mentioned that I took a picture that was 8 minutes long. You won't be able to achieve that out of camera, so I stacked a bunch of filters just to darken the image. And there's a special type of filter called a big stopper. You can't even see through it, and it removes about 10 stops of light. And you have to manually compute in your head how long the exposure is going to be.
Nikon or Canon?
Sorry?
Nikon or Canon?
Nikon or Canon? Canon, but not anymore. So now I'm a Fuji and Leica. And Nicola used to be Nikon, but that's okay, he recovered. But John, just next to him, is still Nikon, and that's not okay. Today, I would recommend, speaking of gear, all cameras today are pretty much really good. Pick the one that feels good to you, where you like the menus and the handling. The Sony A7 is probably the best choice for most people. I took a bunch of pictures you saw with the Sony A7.
What's the most?
My favorite or most used focal length, 50. I use a lot for street photo. For landscape, it's usually between 17 and 24. With my Leica, I use 28, 50, 90, and now I use 12. I really love 12, actually. I have a picture of, yes, that's 12 millimeter. It's very, very wide. Okay, so apparently you have to shut up. I'll be around for the rest of the day. I'll be here tomorrow afternoon as well, so if you have questions, come to me. Thanks.